Among the many changes made to the zone's map in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, the new location of the Brain Scorcher was one of the most surprising for fans. Indeed, the infamous antennas were supposed to prevent stalkers from reaching the center of the zone, by covering the path with dangerous Psi emissions, but the facility was moved away to the west side in a new region called Malachite. So the big question is, how could the Scorcher fulfill its role of impassable Psi field on the way to the zone's center, while simultaneously being located in such a remote part of the zone? This is the main topic we are going to investigate in this video. Spoilers ahead, so watch out and let us begin. Before diving deeper into this subject, I believe it is in order to remind ourselves about the Brain Scorcher's backstory and its portrayal in the games. Developed and constructed as part of Project X, the Raduga, or Rainbow Emitter, was initially tested in 1993. Back then, the installation's purpose was simply to study the electromagnetic emulation of Psi emissions on a large scale. It was quickly found out that the device was not particularly efficient, as its operative range was only about a kilometer and the produced signal was extremely rough. In fact, the type of emissions from Raduga were quite dangerous, being able to inflict serious damage to the human's consciousness. However, some of the scientists, such as Professor Kaloncha, believed it would be possible to fine-tune the installation to turn it into what they called an aggression suppression device. In other words, a psychological weapon capable of altering the minds in a more subtle way, imposing obedience on the targets rather than frying their brains. While this idea would be utilized in some of the later Project X designs, Raduga did not receive such an upgrade. After the Psi consciousness was formed and the anomalous zone was born, it became necessary to protect the zone's center from the threat of outsiders. No stalkers could find out about what was truly going on there. Thus, the Rainbow Emitter was put in service once again, turning anyone attempting to break through into a mindless zombie. Most stalkers did not even know what it was. They just knew that if you stepped too far into the zone, your head would start to boil, and therefore called it the Brain Scorcher. For a long time, the Psi-Fields stood strong, protecting the secrets of the zone. Eventually, though, an investigation by the traders revealed that the Scorcher was man-made, and it had weaknesses. Indeed, the device was not always operating at full power, since it needed some periods to cool down. Exploiting this window, the legendary S.T.A.L.K.E.R managed to reach the facility and deactivate the source, effectively opening the way north. Almost a decade after, the place has been completely abandoned. It looks like the array remained there ever since, rusting away. One of the antennas even collapsed completely. However, we can note that the key components of the emitters that used to be located at the basis of each antenna are missing, so it is likely these parts were scavenged by stalkers or removed by the authorities in order to ensure the Raduga would never be activated again. With this small recap out of the way, let us take a closer look at the issue at hand. The first important thing to understand when it comes to the Brain Scorcher is that it was far from being the only Psi device in the zone. In fact, the Psi consciousness representative confirmed that the Raduga was only one of the many Psi installations that had been set up to block access to the center of the zone. It just happened to be the most infamous among stalkers. Furthermore, when Strider was reminiscing about the time he woke up from monolith brainwashing, he mentioned that was the day the Psi-Fields were turned off. The formulation with plural indicates the presence of several Psi-Fields, all of which went down on the same day. The day that S.T.A.L.K.E.R first disabled the Brain Scorcher, then the monolith installation, and finally shut down Psi consciousness. In the light of such reveals, a theory quickly emerged according to which there was a full network of Psi devices, and when the Scorcher or the monolith or the Psi consciousness, or a combination of the three, were shut down, all the other emitters also went silent. This must be because the Scorcher, the monolith and the Psi consciousness represented essential pieces of the network, and the rest of the devices could not function without them. The idea of a network connecting the various installations from Project X is not new, and has actually been developed in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, since the so-called X network is now confirmed to be a real thing. It's probably no coincidence either that the S.T.A.L.K.E.R program control center, which is definitely linked with Psi emissions, is described as the heart of the X network. That being said, what are the other Psi-Emitters that could be part of the network? To answer this question, we need to understand what a Psi-Emitter is, which is not as obvious as one might think. Generally speaking, there are two main types of Psi emissions: alpha Psi of biological nature and beta Psi of electromagnetic nature. The first is apparently much more difficult to achieve than the second, especially on a large scale. This is why the only significant biological emitter that we know of is the brain in Lab X16. All the other emitters we will discuss are electromagnetic in nature. Furthermore, it appears that standard installations of electromagnetic technologies, such as radio antennas, radars, cupolas, and so on, can be modified to be turned into Psi devices. The most striking example is the Duga, officially part of a missile detection system, that also served in Psi experiments as far back as 1976. After the Zone was born, it was used as a comms center for the military, but in the events of S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, S.T.A.L.K.E.R repurposed its smaller array as a Psi device against the world, and Faust also intended to utilize the radar as a new Brain Scorcher. The story of the Duga is worthy of a video of its own, so I won't enter into more details for the time being. More common devices could also be converted into Psi-Emitters. For instance, the type of antennas from the Krug station can also be found in other places in the zone, including one where the device is a source of Psi emissions. Additionally, the design of some Psi antennas shows no difference with normal radio antennas. The point I'm making here is that any electromagnetic device has the potential to be a Psi emitter, but it is not always clear if the conversion has actually taken place in the past. Let me illustrate with some examples. Firstly, let's take this antenna located at an IPSF checkpoint from the perimeter. Considering its affiliation and position, it is safe to assume this is a normal radio antenna and not a Psi emitter. Secondly, we have the antenna on top of the shelter on Wild Island. Since it zombified a noontider, it obviously is a Psi emitter. Lastly, consider these antennas at the hydrodynamics lab. A bunch of normal radio towers or former Psi emitters. We simply cannot tell. With this in mind, I mapped out all the potential Psi emitters I could find in the game. Green represents devices that are the least likely to have been converted, such as the aforementioned IPSF antenna. Red is for confirmed Psi installations with intent to zombify, and yellow is for those in between, where both scenarios could be possible but we don't have information to draw a conclusion. Special cases like Duga or emitters with a purpose beyond simple brainwashing are marked in blue. Feel free to pause the video to study this map at your heart's content. Now, let us remember the areas that should have been covered by the Brain Scorcher and other Psi-Fields before S.T.A.L.K.E.R took them down, and see if their sources can be attributed to any of the emitters on the map. Obviously, the Malachite region was fully affected by the Psi emissions coming directly from the Raduga. No problem here. Then the Yantar factory was also under the influence of Laboratory X-16, although a route to the Red Forest and Limansk remained accessible. This seems to check out, as the road heading there passes right through between the Psi areas from the Scorcher and X-16. Next, I'd like to focus on the direct way to the CNPP, which I'm sure you've noticed is covered with a lot of potential emitters. This is the Iron Forest, the former electrical station located just below the power plant. While this part of the zone is out of bounds and cannot be accessed in normal gameplay, at least not yet, we can explore it in NoClip and discover that it has been modeled in quite an advanced state. Lo and behold, scattered among the transformers and high-voltage towers stand dozens upon dozens of mysterious antennas. Of course, these antennas do not exist there in real life, and there's no point in putting so many radio towers so close to each other, so their real purpose is quite self-explanatory. These must have been Psi-Emitters, forming an extremely dense part of the Psi network, an impassable grid to prevent any direct access to the center from the southbound route. Moving on, we turn our attention to Yanov, Jupiter and Pripyat, access to which was supposedly also blocked by the Psi-Fields. I say supposedly because some stalkers managed to reach these locations even when the Scorcher was still active, most notably S.T.A.L.K.E.R and his crew, but not only, as proven by the numerous stashes that could be found there as soon as the Psi-Fields fell. From these observations we can conclude that the fields covering Yanov, Jupiter and Pripyat were not 100% effective. There were ways to bypass them and a small number of stalkers knew about it. I found two potential emitters that could fulfill this role. The first is the antenna at the Volkov complex, which might have hindered any attempt to go north directly from Rostock, and helps to somewhat close the gap between the emissions from X-16 and the Iron Forest. The second is the antenna of Pripyat's fire station, located at the border of the city and thus potentially able to add even more challenge to reaching the place. It's a start, but I think these are not enough. There must have been other emitters covering this area of the zone, but for the moment we'll have to settle for what we got. Moving on to the eastern part of the zone, things get even more tricky. We first have the region of the cooling towers. Considering its close proximity to the center, the fact that the Red Fortress was a monolith base and that it housed a part of the X network codenamed Scala, I am inclined to believe that the area was protected by the Psi-Fields. South of there we find many locations that appeared in Call of Pripyat: the cement factory, Kopachi village, the WPS, the sawmill, and then the entire region of Zaton. Normally all the areas from Call of Pripyat were formerly covered by the Psi-Fields, and even if Zaton was moved away from the zone center in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, this fact still appears to remain true. So to summarize, the entirety of the eastern side of the map should have been under the influence of Psi-Emitters. I could not find any at the cooling towers, but they might be hidden inside the Red Fortress or even underground, as we know there is supposed to be a laboratory down there, but it was cut during development. Furthermore, there is an intercom tower near the cement factory that could have served as a Psi-emitter to cover the plant area. As for Zaton, the Psi installation on the roof of Wild Island's shelter might have easily prevented access to the place, since the only routes seem to be passing very close by. Additionally, Azimuth Station stands nearby, and we can also find 3 antennas next to the tower at the hydrodynamics lab. These are possibly more emitters to cover the region of Zaton. Of course, the question of the swamps remains, as this location was not affected by Psi-Fields at the time of clear sky. Since it is now exclusively connected to Zaton, how could it be accessible if Zaton was not? I don't have a clear answer to provide, although I suspect the remote nature of the swamps must have something to do with it. Well, there are some holes in our net, so to speak, but I think the overall picture is not so bad. Even more so when we superimpose the known parts of the X network on the map. Yet, I've been thinking. This whole time we assumed a Psi-Emitters area of effect is like a sphere around the source, like radio waves sent on all directions with a similar intensity. But what if it wasn't the case? With the correct equipment, electromagnetic waves can be directed and focused in a specific direction. Therefore, so can Psi emissions. With this in mind, we can imagine certain Psi devices emitting in a specific direction, and the signal being picked up and amplified by other Psi installations on the way. In fact, the monolithian emitters are described as transmitters of the signal in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, and Dalin also explained that their mesh, which is the same as Duga but in miniature, can be used to amplify Psi radiation. There is a theory that large antennas, such as the Raduga, are the main sources of the Psi emissions, and the other smaller contraptions only act as some sort of relay stations for the signal. This would explain why turning off the Scorcher resulted in the other Psi fields going down. I am not entirely convinced by this version though, because the descriptions we have of the Raduga's capabilities don't match this narrative. Besides, I believe that the Psi fields fell due to the shutdown of the X network, rather than the Scorchers. However, this does not exclude the possibility of other emitters having such a behavior, especially when they are linked to the network. After all, this is how the remote connection between X11 and the generators was meant to be handled, via two relay stations represented by azimuth and scala. In short, there is no way to know for sure which shape and form the Psi fields took back then, and our attempt at retro-engineering by mapping out the potential emitters, while very interesting, remains highly hypothetical. At least I hope you found the exercise entertaining. Before we wrap up, I'd like to talk a bit more about the X network. If anything, the creation of the Brain Scorcher was one of the key founding steps in building the X network, both in the lore and on the developer's side. Indeed, Raduga was one of the first large-scale beta Psi-Emitters from Project X, opening the way to crucial progress in Psi technologies for the scientists working in the zone. Moreover, Radar was one of the oldest levels created by the developers of Shadow of Chernobyl, inspired by the real-life Duga, that would soon be joined by many more Psi devices added by GSC to expand the gallery of crazy installations that emerged from the secret experiments. The X network itself is not just composed of standard Psi-Emitters meant to zombify people. It also contains a variety of more interesting contraptions designed for a more subtle use of Psi emissions. Without entering into details, we experienced some of them firsthand in S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, and I'm sure we will see more in the future. This is what the Raduga led to. This is the Brain Scorcher's legacy. Thank you very much for watching, Stalkers, and I'll see you in the next video.